We started to talk about Pesach, and we spoke a lot about the word Shana. Shana means year, but the other translations of the word Shana mean change and repetition. Change and repetition seem to be opposites, because repetition means sameness and change means the opposite of sameness, and yet they're both true. During the course of a year, all kinds of things change. Every year, the same changes take place. Winter, spring, summer, fall, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah, Purim, and so on. And we discussed that it's a circle. If we allow the time to come to us, every year we repeat the same circle. If we go to the time, if we utilize the time, we're also going around in a circle, but we're climbing a spiral staircase. Each time we're repeating the same cycle, doing the same Yom Tovs over and over and over again, we're growing. And this is where it becomes personal and individual, the Avodah. Since now is Pesach, we must focus on the Avodah of Pesach. And we did touch on this a little bit, and I went back to the beginning, right, once upon a time. We spoke about, first of all, the idea that until Abraham there were individual tzaddikim, holy people. They may have been holier than any Jew ever will be. They may have been like Chanoich from the Shemitah Rishayna, all that exotic Kabbalistic stuff. But it was a avodas yachid. It was the service of an individual. Rabbi Isaac Homler once said, it's one of the most frequently quoted Rabbi Isaac Homlers, at least in my little world, who said once that Adam Arishan was not a Rebbe. Had he been a Rebbe, he could not have sinned. Adam Arishan is Kabbalistically greater than Moshe Rabbeinu. The only person greater than Adam Arishan is Mashiach himself. Adam Arishan is, according to the Ramah, according to Kabbalah, Chaya, and Moshe Rabbeinu is only Neshama, the general soul of the Madrega of Neshama. And Adam Arishan sinned, and Moshe Rabbeinu did not. Why? Or at least Adam Arishan's sin has affected all of the generations. Why? Because as great a man as he was Yitzir Kappa Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu, he was the handiwork of Hashem. God made him. His name appears in the Divrei Yamim in the beginning of Chronicles with a large aleph, which is explained Kabbalistically to be a madrega that's higher than, say, the Shtalshlus. But it was a personal service. It was an individual. Avraham begins tikkun, as they state. The Chazal tell us that Shit al Veshnin Hava Alma, the world stands for 6,000 years. Shnei Alofim Teyu, Shnei Alofim Teira, Shnei Alofim Yemesa Mashiach. 2,000 years are chaos, 2,000 years are the era of Torah, and 2,000 years are the times of Mashiach, as they state in Medrash. Avraham Avinu was born 1948. So he was 52 years old when the second group of millennia began. He was the very, very end of what's called Toyu, chaos. And his life was essentially lived in the world of Tikkun. And in that year, when Avraham Avinu was 52, that was the year that they had a flood of the great dispersion, where people were scattered all over the world, like it says in Chumash in the end of Parshas Noach. So for the first 2,000 years, things were chaos. Chaos means extreme. If it was bad, it was evil, evil, evil. And if it was good, it was holy, holy, holy. Like Chanoich, there's a whole medrash which describes Chanoich. Chanoich was a tzaddik. He was so holy, but he didn't live on the planet. He was completely removed. And the same is true of other tzaddikim who lived during that era. There was no connection between them and the world. There was no connection between them and other people, and so on. The onset of the 2,000 years of Torah, and Avraham Avinu, that's the first patriarch of the Jewish nation, begins what's considered not a condition of individual giants serving God, but of a nation serving God. And a nation means tzaddikim, beinanim, urishoyim, that you need to have. You need to have means not you do have. You must have righteous, ordinary, and sinners. I mentioned yesterday that it's brought in Sfarim from the Levush that if you come to Shul Yom Kippur and there's no sinner in your congregation, you shouldn't have it. You need to have an Avaryan. You need to have a cross-section of Jews. That's a Jewish people. One of the reasons for a minyan is having 10 people as representative of the 10 categories of Jews. It says in Chazal that there is 10 sugim of Yidden, from the Shechem, Sheftechem, from the heads all the way down till the water carriers and the wood choppers. And I'm not sure exactly how you can count 10. If you'll figure it out, please let me know, because I can't figure it out. But the reason for a minyan is that they represent diversity, different types. 10 different categories of Jews that merge together to become a minyan, that merge together to become a nation, and so on. This is the essence of the change that begins with Avraham Avinu. It's no longer about individual righteous people, it's about a nation. And Avraham is the first patriarch, Yitzchak is the second, and Yaakov is the third. There's a need to have three. I explained it yesterday. Because Torah encompasses every emotion. Torah has within itself the whole panorama, the whole rainbow of different human emotions, from the most extreme of chesed to most extreme of gevura and everything in between. And all 613 mitzvahs, the mitzvahs that are most chesed shebachesed, as well as the mitzvahs that are the most gevura shebagvura, have to fit into the personality of every Jew. As I explained yesterday, that when Hashem offered the Torah to the various nations, there's a part of Yiddishkeit which they were completely in concurrence with, and there was a part of Yiddishkeit which they couldn't fathom, because every people has, as individuals and as communities, natures, personalities. Parts of Torah have a tremendous appeal to their personality because that's in their nature, and parts of Torah are abhorrent to them because it's outside their personality. For example, in the age in which we live, the kindness described in Torah has a tremendous appeal to the secular world. But the discipline and the gevura and the strength and the concept of punishment and the concept of as the Rambam writes it, if you're kind to a cruel person, you're being cruel to kind people. That kind of ethos runs against the grain of our civilization. 100 years ago, it was perfectly reasonable. 100 years from today, it may be perfectly reasonable again. But Yiddishkeit encompasses within itself the whole panorama of human emotions, and we needed to inherit that from 3 patriarchs and 4 matriarchs. As I told you, the Alter Rebbe says in the Likutei Torah that they represent the 7 emotions. The 3 of us and the 4 Imois represent the 7 midas. But that wasn't enough. Then came Mitzrayim, because we needed to go through the refinery, the melting pot. And I explained yesterday to you the reason this was so necessary. The reason this was so necessary is because we had to be born as a people. And the first requisite of being born as a people is the old has to be removed. The new crop grows when the old seed deteriorates. And that was the purpose of Golus Mitzrayim. And then we continued and said that Golus Mitzrayim could have been in one way, and it turned out to be in a different way. The exiled Jewish people in Egypt, de facto, in reality, was only we came to 113 or 116 or 118 years, whatever the math would be. But it certainly was not 400 years or 430 years. It wasn't even the 210 that's written in the Chazal, because until Levi died, and he lived the longest of the Shvatim, he lived 136 years. And if you do the math, he came to Mitzrayim, he was approximately 43 years old. Until he passed away, there was no Golus at all. Until the last of the Shvatim died, the Golus didn't even begin. And then starts the Havan Chakmalei. But the 116 years is 4 or 5 generations. And eventually you're dealing with a people who are so enslaved they have no concept of freedom. And the slavery in Egypt was brutal, and it was senseless, and it was cruel for the sake of being cruel. The purpose of enslaving the Jews was not to get them to work. The purpose of enslaving the Jews was to keep them down. That was the whole point. Don't let them raise their heads. Don't let them challenge the fact that we're the superior race. That was the only purpose. So they made them do parech, useless work. The Egyptians, it says in some Sfarim, that they would make them build these huge towers and then destroy them and have them build them again. Because they were built for no purpose other than to keep them occupied. That's it. And this was the Kurabaz, the melting pot. Now, what were the 2 options of how it could have turned out? The first, the ideal would have been that Yidden would go through this terrible tzara. By the way, this was foretold. Hashem told Avraham Avinu that this would happen. And they would remain loyal to their tradition. The tradition of Yidden didn't necessarily mean all 613 mitzvahs. But the tradition that they had certainly was about one God. It certainly was opposed to the idea of many gods. It certainly was about prayer. It certainly was about kindness. These were the messages. This was the legacy of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And the Jewish people had, to be very simplistic, the Sheva Mitzvahs Lineach. And the Rebbe says in a Sikha, had the Jewish people gone through the hell they went through and preserved their tradition, held on to their separateness from Mitzrayim, and not assimilated, not become pagan, not become so immersed in the idol worship of Egypt that it was a virtually indistinguishable who is a Jew and who is an Egyptian, then the exodus of Yidden from Mitzrayim and the subsequent Matan Torah would have been Mashiach, would have been a culmination. Instead, what happened, the Jewish people became so enslaved that they forfeited their souls. They became Egyptified. They became the Egyptian culture. And when it came time to take them out of Mitzrayim, the Jew was virtually indistinguishable from the Egyptian. The Egyptian was in 50 levels of spiritual uncleanness, and the Jew was only in 49 levels of spiritual uncleanness. But that was the difference. I'm sure you've heard the Medrash, that the Medrash says, this is based heavily on the Rambam, look at the Sichas Chelik Hey, that when Hashem made the world, He made a condition with the Yam Suf, that when the Jewish people come, it would split. It says, "Yashav Hayam Lifnei Zbeike Lei Sanei," says the Medrash split tonight to its prior condition. So the Yam Suf knew 2,448 years ahead of time that one day is going to have to split. The Jewish people come to the Yam Suf, and the Eibishter says, "Split." And the Yam Suf says, "For who?" "For the Jews." And the Yam Suf says, "I don't recognize them. Halalu v'halalu." They look identical to the Egyptians. Halalu v'yavedizor v'halalu. The Yam said to the Eibishter that they look like pagans, and they look like pagans. I negotiated to split for the one group of people who believes in one God. I can't tell them apart. And the Eibishter said, "Yeah, but they're the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Split." So the Yam Suf had no choice but to split. But that was not how it needed to be. It's how it turned out. It could have been that there would be a physical enslavement that would have been only a physical enslavement. Unfortunately, it was a spiritual enslavement as well. And the Rebbe says that this explains what we say by the Pesach Seder, that if Hashem had not redeemed our ancestors from Egypt, we'd still be in Egypt. Because what we're doing from Yetzias Mitzrayim till Mashiach, it's well over 3,300 years, is deserve Yetzias Mitzrayim. In other words, correct the deficiency that we left Mitzrayim with. What was supposed to occur was that we should leave Mitzrayim refined and corrected, that we should deserve what you would call the Pnimius, the Neshama of Torah, should appear in the world and never depart. What we got instead was a temporary experience of the Neshama of Torah, and then it left, and we're left only with the guf, with the body, with the chitzonius of Torah. Until Mashiach, we're earning Yetzias Mitzrayim. Says the Siddur, until Mashiach, it is actually true that if Hashem had decided to keep us in Mitzrayim until we're ready to leave, we're still not ready. What's the proof we're still not ready? The Mashiach is still not revealed. So when the time came, Hashem took us out. Like it says in the Siddur, Baruch Shem Yatachas Lisol, we thank Hashem for keeping His promises. He promised Abraham 400 years. The 400 years came, we were ready, we weren't ready, took us out of Egypt. Sure. And I want to talk about the slavery a little bit more. Okay, this took me a long time, but this is a review from yesterday. I want to talk about the slavery a little bit. First of all, there is a Maharal Miprag. I believe it's a Maharal, but it's cited many times by the Rebbe. It's beautiful, very, very special. The Maharal Miprag asks a question. We sit by the Pesach Seder and we say, we're free. If Hashem hadn't freed us, we'd still be slaves. Yidden said that in the concentration camps. Yidden said that in their cellars of Inquisition-infested Spain. Yidden said that in the worst of times. Exactly what were they celebrating? Freedom? This isn't freedom at all. And if you wanted to be honest, even Golus America, which is so free and so blessed, is also Golus. We're slaves to a civilization, to a culture, which is alien to Torah, totally alien to Torah. So the question, of course, is, Maral asks, if in the time of the first Pesach Mikdash, Yidden said, we're free people, fine. But why are we celebrating freedom sitting in Golus, especially in the more severe Golus? This is the question of Maral Mebra. And the Maral gives a beautiful answer, and it's beautiful because it's also very, very real and powerful. He says essentially the following, and again, I've never seen the Maral inside, but it's quoted in many sikhs. Slavery is not only a physical condition, it's a psychological one. Slavery is not only servitude, where one person is treated like the commodity of another and is abused and used for the betterment of the master at complete sacrifice of the slave. Slavery is the slave accepting that as real. Slavery is the slave accepting that as true. If a slave knows that slavery is unnatural, and it's cruel, and it's wrong, and he wishes he wasn't a slave, but in fact he is a slave, then he's not a slave. Slavery is that point, that nekude, that pintele, where the slave loses the initiative to be free. The slave doesn't want to be free. The slave is frightened by freedom. In Chumash we read, the Chazal tell us that when Yidden had to leave Mitzrayim, 4 out of 5 preferred the slavery than to leave. Why? Because their whole culture was, we need somebody to take care of us. The people who take care of us use their children as cinder blocks. Literally. So they weren't exactly taking such good care of them. But they had this mentality of dependency on slaves. People who do the studies on the psychology of victims of severe abuse describe a relationship that develops between the captor and the captives. We're in this completely convoluted, sick way. There's a loyalty. The captive is so intimidated, is so terrorized by his master that they identify themselves with him, that they almost feel a loyalty. And as though this brutal Rosh HaMerusha is some kind of a protector, it's a kind of a guard protecting them. It's a psychological condition. This is slavery. Slavery is not only the technical condition of being treated like property and used by another person, it's accepting it. The history of the American emancipation, right, whatever it was, 145 years ago approximately, a little bit less, Lincoln freed the slaves. But he didn't really free the slaves. I mean, there was a lot of politics around the freedom of the slaves. But the reason I say he didn't free the slaves is because he took away their masters. He didn't make them free. And there's a very big difference. When a nation has been enslaved for 300 years, you know what it means to be enslaved? You're not better than a cow or a chicken or a goat. Yeah, they bring cows to market. They were slave markets. Somebody told me that you can go to South Carolina and the slave markets exist. You can go and come to a place where they sold slaves like chickens. The mother gets up on the stage, she's holding a 4 or 5 year old child, or even a 4 or 5 month old child, and they're selling just the baby. It's unbelievable. Just like you'll take a calf from the nurse mother after whatever it is, 3 months or 6 months, whatever the nursing period is, and sell the calf to a different owner, they sold human beings like that. The servitude, the slavery is not just that people beat you up if you don't deliver your quota. The slavery is you're not a person. You belong to another. And when you accept that, you're a slave. If you don't accept it, you're enslaved, but you're not a slave. Says the Maharal, the Jewish people in Egypt were slaves. They were not enslaved, they were slaves. They lost their soul. They accepted the role of submission and servitude as the status quo, as the truth, as reality. It's like the famous marshal about the people who live in caves for generation upon generation, and there's this old myth that there's such a thing called a sun, and nobody believes it, That's what happens to a slave. Freedom becomes a myth. The idea that every human being owns himself and gets to make decisions for himself is not lost technically, it's lost psychologically and spiritually. Says the Maharal, when the Eibusha took us out of Egypt, he made it impossible for a Jew to be a slave. Not impossible for a Jew to be enslaved, but impossible for a Jew to... A Yid cannot be psychologically made into a slave. He can behaviorally made into a slave. You cannot take away the freedom nerve in a Yid. Says Maharal, this is why you sit in a concentration camp at a Pesach Seder and you say, we're free. Because the burden of independence, of freedom, of free will, of being people for ourselves, taking our own initiatives, which has the responsibility side to it. The Eibishter gave it to Yidden as a permanent fact. You cannot enslave a Jew. You cannot make a Jew into a slave. You can enslave him. You can even kill him. You cannot take away the freedom nerve, the inyan of being independent from a Yid. So Maharal says it's credible, it's true to say under all conditions, thank God that you out of Egypt, Maharal says. It's a beautiful pshat. Just one moment or two. But I want to add another dimension to this. And that's the spiritual dimension. When we say that the Jewish people were slaves in Mitzrayim, we mean first of all that they were not only enslaved, but that they became slaves. And what was more frightful to them than the slavery itself was the freedom. And again, after the Africans were freed from slavery in the United States, many of them wanted the slavery back. Because they were given no land, they were given no education, they weren't given anything to make them free, they just took away their masters. The masters, as brutal as they were to them, fed them and clothed them. You know why they fed them and clothed them? Because they loved them. For the same reason you feed a cow. You don't feed a cow, it doesn't give milk. You don't feed a slave, it can't work. But that they had. And now even this was taken from them. In other words, they freed the slaves, but the slaves were not free. Because they were not rehabilitated. You can't take people who for 300 years, it's institutionalized, it's in the genes. I mean, things do become hereditary after a while, that these people have no concept, or had no concept of what it means to be free. So there was a lot of politics. In other words, it's very nice that we free slaves, but that's not how you free slaves. You want to free slaves, give them freedom. It's like you have today. I mean, the parallel for this today is the prison system. The worst place to stop being a criminal, to learn how to not be a criminal, is in the prison system. When a person goes to prison, he comes out a bigger Russia than he entered. So what did you do? You put him away, so he couldn't hurt anybody, now you put him back on the street. He can't get a job, he can't work, he doesn't know how to deal with normal people, he doesn't know how to be honest, he doesn't know how to survive on a level of personal respect, and respect for fellow, and mutual respect. He has no concept of it. Because the prisons are jungles. It's a similar kind of a concept. So the Jewish people in Messiah were slaves. Now there's another dimension to it. And that is that the servitude was so whole that they became slaves of the worship of the Egyptians. They became slaves to the Avodah Zarah, to the deity. What the Egyptians worshipped, the Jewish people worshipped. What did the Egyptians worship? They worshipped, I love to say this, the river the Nile, right? The river the Nile, that's what they worshipped. It says in all the holy books that Rebbe speaks about it in the Sichos. What is unique about the river the Nile? What is unique about Egypt as opposed to Israel? The river the Nile almost never dries up. Right? It says in Chumash that there was supposed to be 7 years of famine, but that was a very exceptional thing. If you live along the river denial, which is where the ancient Egyptian culture and civilization was, you're always secured of water. And water is life. Water is food. And if you read Rambam, if you ever read Rambam, you know Rambam says that the center of pagan worships was the reliance on agriculture. That's why they worship the cow, because the cow plows and provides them with food. There's a lot of details about the way they worshipped. Rambam writes that even today, in India, they don't eat cows, and they worship them. They said the Rambam. Rambam wrote it 800 years ago. It's true today also, because the cow they considered the mother of parnasa, of food. And in Egypt, they worshipped the river, because the river was a source of life. And it was a predictable source of life. In other words, religion, connection to one God, is predicated on looking heavenward. Like the land of Israel doesn't have a river that can sufficiently irrigate it. You need rain. And Eretz Yisrael is called Eretz Harav of Kais, a land of mountains and outcroppings of rock, because you need the mountains to hold the water and bring the water into the valley in a seasonal way, and that you should be able to irrigate the fields. But rainwater is fluctuating. Rainwater changes. You can have abundant years, and you can have very meager years. You can have very, very lean years. You can have drought years. So you have to look to the heavens. So it says in the holy books that in Mitzrayim they were so secure by Parnasa they never prayed. There was no reason to. And that's why it's called the land of Klippa. The land itself is not conducive to recognizing the dependency upon Hashem. Eretz Yisrael is called the Holy Land because the land itself makes you look to the heavens. It makes you dependent on Hashem. That doesn't mean that Hashem is going to make you starve. It means you have to pray. So the whole culture of Egypt revolved around the permanence, the never-changing nature of this body of water, which meant that they never needed to submit, they never needed to humble themselves, they never needed to say, we need. It was always there. In other words, the worship of the river Nile was in effect the worship of security. Or to say it in philosophical terms, it was the worship of the so-called laws of nature. It was the worship of Derech HaTeva. That's what they worshipped. They worshipped the constancy of their natural lives. They worshipped the lack of need to depend on something that they couldn't see. Everything was explicable. Their whole world made sense. And it was a very controlled and limited world. There was no God in it. There was no necessity for God. There was no prayer in it. There was no necessity for it. And they therefore mocked God, mocked prayer. And the Jewish people became slaves to the river Nile. In other words, they became slaves to Alakim. To that Alakim is Begematria HaTeva. Pari says, I don't know Havaya. Moshe Rabbeinu comes to Pari and says, let my people go. He says, who said? God. Which God? Havaya. I don't know such a God. He asked him, what does Havaya mean? It means the God of the miracle. No such thing. If you said to me, Elakim, I know Elakim. He swims around in that river. Derech HaTeva, nature, the reliable and predictable and always blessed nature of the river Nile. And he therefore refused to let the Jewish people go. The Jewish people were slaves to that culture. Like the Rebbe says in the Siches, I'm sure you know it, that the Jewish boys were thrown into the river. They were thrown to the God of nature. They were thrown to be immersed in the belief that everything has to be predictable and controlled, and there's no such thing as faith. The boys had to be drowned in the river. The girls had to be kept alive, says the Rebbe Techayid, in the spirit of Mitzrayim. There wasn't only that Hashem was killing the boys and not the girls. He was dealing with each gender differently. The boys had to be killed. The girls had to be raised in the spirit of the river Nile. This was, in other words, Hashem Pari was actually punishing not just the boys but the girls as well, just in different ways. In the spirit of the Nilus. That's what the Rebbe teaches it. Not let them live. Give them life, but an Egyptian life. Techayim means you should give them life. Says the Rebbe, why is Pari worried about the girls living? So he says, because just like he was destroying the boys by drowning them in the river, he was destroying the girls by keeping them alive.
Is it Kolben?
Oh, I don't know. We're not going there. He was a Rosh Merusha Pari, Kasha Pari. Okay, so this was what the situation was. As a result, the Jewish people were slaves. They were slaves to the Egyptians. They They were slaves in their own minds, and they were slaves to the worship of the Egyptians. And then Moshe Rabbeinu appears. Moshe Rabbeinu disappeared from Mitzrayim for 50, 60 years. It's one of the weirdest things. I mean, it's weird. Who suffered with Yidden and Golus? No. Miriam was called Mar al Shem Meridas HaGolus. Her name was Miriam because when she was born, the bitterness started. And she mothered the Jewish people for 85 years. Aaron HaKohen was the prophet of the Jewish people. Moshe Rabbeinu was a king in Ethiopia for 40 years. For 40 years. On the Shet Midrash. He came to Midian, to Yisrael, who knows when. And he's the Savior. As David Shekavot. He was not in Mitzrayim. It's really strange. But that's how David operates. No, he didn't consult me when we made the plans. I'm saying, this is what he wants. Moshe emerges, 80 years old. He shows up in Mitzrayim, and he gives the Jewish people the secret code. Pocket Pakadati. The Jewish people knew this code. It's been passed along from father to son amongst the elders that the future Redeemer of the Jewish people is going to come along with the message of Pocket Pakadati. So they knew that he was a messenger from God. Well, the other name, this is a Shena Maise, but it says in Rashi, the Pocket Pakadati. There's all kinds of discussions. If everybody knew Pocket Pakadati, so what kind of big chocham did you have to be to say Pocket Pakadati? I could have said it also. So there's different explanations for it. Everybody knew Pocket Pakadati. Yosef said to his brothers, Pocket Yifkad Elokim Eschem. So they knew. So there's one explanation is that only the elders knew, and not everybody. And if Moshe Rabbeinu knew, there was a sign that came from the Eibishter. And the other pshat in the Taka, everybody knew. And nevertheless, somehow Pocket Pakadati was a sign. And perhaps that's why the Jewish people were not so quick to believe him. Whatever the case is, Ein Kana Makam. These are all details. And he said, I came to take you out of Mitzrayim. Wow, great idea. Where are we going to go? Into the desert. What are we going to do? We're going to worship God. What are we going to eat? Trust the Eibishter. That's all. Trust him. Yidden could not do that. The Nisayan of Yetzias Mitzrayim was enormous. 4 out of 5 elected to remain. What was the test? Moshe did one miracle and a second miracle and a third miracle and a fourth miracle. They saw Nisim like you see the sun shining. Every month there was an enormous miracle which crushed the most powerful nation in the world in an unbelievable way.
It's a miracle, not.
And the minute the miracle passed, 5 minutes later, world returns. The Jew says to Moshe, what are we eating in the mitzvah? Moshe says, don't you trust the Eibishter? He made water turn to blood. He made frogs multiply by being hit on the head. Earth became lice. And the Yid says, but I have what to eat today. Why should I go out into the desert and trust the Eibishter? It's illogical, but that's the degree of dehumanization of slavery. Slavery not just in the technical sense of enslavement, but the psychological and spiritual sense of slavery. The worst part of being a slave is that you don't consider yourself human, not that your master doesn't. And part of not considering yourself human is incapable of caring for yourself. Trust was outside the parameter of the Jewish possibility because they were slaves. They were slaves to the river the Nile. They were slaves to the idea you can only live where there's a body of water that never dries. And you never have to look heavenward. You never have to pray. It's always available. In the desert you have to pray. The Eden says, we can't pray. 4 out of 5 elected to remain behind and died during the 3 days of Choshech, it says in Rashi, because they had a problem with Amunah. Problem with B'tach. Don't we all, huh? But it was most acute at that time. They were the birth. They were the first generation. And Emunah was extremely difficult to them. B'tach and Emunah was against their very core. It was against their very, very essence. But 20% left Mitzrayim. And their greatest schus, their greatest merit, was that they trusted the Eibishter. Yes, they made a bris milah, which they hadn't done for many years, for many generations. Yes, they made a carbon Pesach and defied the Egyptians, stubbed their nose in the Egyptian faces, and watched the Egyptians and their firstborn face off in a civil war and mercifully murder one another in the thousands. But the greatest declaration that the Jewish people did in the unilateral emancipation which the Eibusher brought upon them was to trust him, because it was against their whole muhus. They couldn't trust. They had no munah. And the Eibusher took them out of Mitzrayim. And you watch the Chumash, you see how precarious their faith is. The smallest thing goes wrong, they go bananas. The moment they don't have everything that they need, they whine. Moshe says, a little trust, a little faith. You just saw the sea split. You saw bodies of water produce fruits. It says that there were 12 divisions. Every shade had a different gezer, a different chasm in the water to walk through, and there was food to eat. It was Gan Eden. Abyssal Amunah. They couldn't have a munah. They traveled 3 days without water. They made an uprising. And it repeated itself 10 times, because what was the test of the Jewish people? They were very smart. They could learn Torah. They could do mitzvahs. But the minute the Eibusher put them in a situation where the Eibusher says, trust, they couldn't. You know the old joke about a guy who comes to God and says, he says that 1,000 years is for Hashem a day. Can you lend me money for a couple of days? The Eibusher says, sure, just wait a few minutes. This was the whole story. The Eibusher says, I'm going to give you everything, just wait a few minutes. The Eibusher wanted to bring forward their emunah. It was hard for them. You know, one of the stories that I always think of is the story with Shaul HaMelech. I consider the two people who got the toughest judgment from the Eibusher in the whole Tanakh as Reuven and Shaul HaMelech. And they were both the first. Reuven was punished so severely for what? And Shaul was the same way. Shaul did two Avedas. For one, he lost eternal kingship, and for the other, he essentially lost his kingship immediately. The second one was a story with Amalek, which we can understand, although we don't want to be tested. But what was the first test? What was the first test? It's really a remarkable story. Forgive me for saying it. It almost was not fair. Shaul was made the king of the Jews. What is the king? Is a leader and a unifier. The Jews had lived traditional tribal existences for 300 and some years, and one shevet is being pummeled, attacked on a nightly basis and a daily basis, and the other shevet's living on the fat of land and has no idea that their brethren are being beaten up, whether it was by the Plishtim, or it was by Aram, or it was by Moav or Ammon. I mean, the Jews had a lot of people who loved to beat them up. Now they have a king, so they mobilize all their forces. They're a nation, they're a unified army, and the Philistines attack. And Shmuel says to Shaul, the Navi, the prophet Samuel says, just wait for me to show up. You'll go fight with. So the Philistines attack, and the army sits there, and they attack, and the army sits there for 7 days. You know how long 7 days is? What do you think the Plishtim did? They came into a town and asked for a glass of water? They destroyed, and Shaul is sitting with the army and he's not moving, and the generals are saying, what are you doing? And Shaul didn't tell him. Shmuel said I should wait. Shaul said, we're going to wait. We're going to wait for what? To have nothing to defend? And he waited 7 days. 15 minutes before Shmuel shows up, Shaul couldn't wait anymore. Huh? I'll give you the Eibusher's email. You'll send them a fax. It was an unbelievable test. What was the test? It was the test of Amunah. And the Eibusher was going to test the Yidden when they left Mitzrayim. It was a test of faith. And faith was so hard. Faith is still hard. Boy, is it hard. But for them, faith was unthinkably hard, because they were slaves. And the Eibusher said to the Jewish people basically this: I will give you everything. All I want is trust. And the Eibusher knows how to test. The tests are so difficult that it's literally a fair trade-off. You trust him, you deserve everything. Now that doesn't sound like it's fair. Yeah, if you and I are doing business and I say, I trust you, does that mean you're going to give me the Brooklyn Bridge and Yisrael and a Torah and peace and Mashiach? And the Eibusher knows how to test. He tests so thoroughly, so comprehensively, for the emunah and bitachon alone, you deserve kol tuv. And again, the example is Shaul. I push the David knows what he's doing, but this is it's Shaul HaMelech was so great. It says in Kabbalah he was greater than David. Shaul HaMelech was so great that the Eibishter expected more of him. The Eibishter expected him to wait and to wait and to wait, and they're killing Jews, and he's sitting with an army. He's sitting with an army. He's doing nothing. Not for a half a day, for a week. And the Jewish people said, what do we make you a king for? To stop us from fighting? It's an unbelievable test, but this is called the test of Bitachon. And Shaul failed. As powerful as it is. And the Yidden in Mitzrayim, this was the test. They 10 times, the Eibishter tested their faith, and each time they didn't have enough. Because Emunah was the most difficult thing for them specifically, and let's not kid ourselves, it's still the most difficult thing. Because it's always a little bit more than you can give. Just a drop more. 15 minutes more, that's it. Hang on a second. And what was so difficult about it was because they had been conditioned not to trust anything. That was what Mitzrayim was. That's what the slavery was physically. That's what the slavery was psychologically. And that's what the slavery was religiously. That's what they worshipped in Egypt. Verstehst? And tomorrow we'll talk about the excess, the redemption. You're waiting half an hour, and I have to give you 100 yashar koyachs. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, that one of them, you started with saying that the Maharal started to explain why the Eden, even in the Holocaust, in the camps and all of this, they also say
we're free.
We are free. And the thing is that it is only this DNA, the genes that you say that it's in our genes. What we got in Pesach, in Yetziat Mitzrayim, is that it was embedded in us, in our genes, this freedom. The Emunah, maybe we had to earn, but to be free, it's there. And what happened? It was embedded in us as a gift, or I don't know what, but its effect is that when they were standing in the Holocaust camps, and one of the things that irritated the most, the Marshman, when they were standing naked, right near, surrounded with all of the Gader Ukranit.
The barbed wire.
And all of this with the wires which were hard and all of this, and one of them will start singing Ani Ma'amin, and they were beaten with
bayonets.
Horrible, and it was going on, and even strength, the Ani Ma'amin. They never gave up. They started to sing. One of them will start, and the whole group started to sing, naked as the whale, singing. And this was the worst thing that the Marshman could accept, They couldn't stop it.
Sure they could. They
couldn't stop it.
With bullets.
Yeah, with the bullets. But with the hitting and beating, nothing stopped it.
Yeah.
And this is like the Ivanim that wanted to take this out. Everybody of them, and the Rome and all of this.
But it's still,
it's in the genes.
Yeah, but it still hurts. And the Holocaust.
Hurts? It's horrible.
It's intolerable. It's unfathomable. You wanted to say something.
I wanted to ask the thing, Shaul and Ruvain. What was the thing with Ruvain?
Not now. Come tomorrow, next week, next year. I'll put them all.
No, but
for coming one day, I'm going to reward you.
Okay. Will you speak about it tomorrow?
What? No. We're talking about Pesach.